Christmas is coming, and I will be alone this year. So please leave a Christmas greeting that will warm my heart in the comments. Okay, let's go. The Frostbitten Visitor. It was a Christmas we'd planned for months, a getaway to a secluded cabin deep in the Rockies. My wife, Amanda, and I wanted something peaceful, far from the constant buzz of the city. Snow blanketed the landscape when we arrived, turning the forest into a picture-perfect winter wonderland. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a large front window overlooking the woods. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbours for miles. We loved it. For the first couple of days, we spent our time hiking, drinking hot cocoa, and reading by the fire. The nights were quieter than anything I'd ever experienced. It was almost too quiet. On the third night, as we sat by the fire playing cards, there was a knock at the door. It was so unexpected that we both froze. "Did you hear that?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into my chest. Probably a tree branch. But then it came again. A loud, deliberate knock. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and moved cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. "Hello?" I called out. No response. When I opened the door, a blast of icy wind hit me, but the porch was empty. Fresh snow covered the ground, untouched by footprints. Amanda stood behind me, clutching a blanket. "Who knocks in the middle of nowhere?" I didn't have an answer, but I locked the door and double-checked all the windows before we went to bed. That night, I woke to the sound of faint scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind against the cabin, but as I listened closer, it sounded deliberate, like fingernails dragging against wood. It was coming from the front door. "Amanda," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What is it?" she mumbled groggily. "Listen." We both stayed silent, the scratching continuing for several more seconds before stopping abruptly. "Maybe it's an animal," she suggested, though her voice wavered. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, the unease stayed with us. Amanda tried to brush it off, but I could tell she was on edge. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. That evening, as we sat by the fire, the knock came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight and a fireplace poker, motioning for Amanda to stay back. When I opened the door, I saw him. A man stood on the porch, hunched and shivering. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale as the snow, and his eyes were hollow, like there was nothing behind them. "Please," he croaked. "I'm lost." Something about him felt off, but I couldn't just shut the door on him. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" I asked, my grip tightening on the poker. He nodded weakly, his lips trembling. Amanda stepped forward, despite my warning look. "We can't leave him out there," she said. Reluctantly, I stepped aside, letting him in. As he crossed the threshold, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Amanda fetched him a blanket, and I sat him by the fire, but he barely seemed to notice. "What's your name?" I asked. He didn't answer, just stared into the flames. Amanda tried again. "Where are you from?" This time, he slowly turned his head toward her, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "From here," he whispered, his voice like the wind through dead trees. The words sent a chill down my spine. "I'm going to call for help," I said, though I knew there was no service. I stepped into the kitchen, pretending to dial on my phone. When I returned, the man was gone. "Where is he?" I asked Amanda, panic rising in my chest. Her face was pale. Walked out. Didn't say anything. I rushed to the door, but he was nowhere in sight. The snow outside was undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all. That night, we barricaded the door with furniture and slept with the fire poker by the bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, the scratching started again. This time, it was louder, more frantic. Amanda clung to me, her breathing shallow. "Don't open it," she whispered. "I won't," I promised, though my heart was pounding. The scratching turned into pounding, and then the door handle began to rattle. "Let me in," a voice rasped from the other side. It was him. We didn't answer, didn't move, just held our breath as the rattling grew more violent. Suddenly, it stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then the window shattered. Amanda screamed as a gust of freezing air filled the room. The fire flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then we saw him. He stood in the corner of the room, his face twisted into something inhuman. His hollow eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light. "You let me in once," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You can't keep me out now." The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around us. Amanda grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the bedroom. We slammed the door shut, but it didn't matter. The walls seemed to pulse, the wood groaning as if it were alive. And then, silence. When we finally gathered the courage to leave the room, the cabin was empty. The shattered window was intact, the furniture undisturbed. But on the mantel, where there had been nothing before, sat a single wooden figure. It was a carving of the man, his twisted face frozen in a grotesque grin. We left the cabin that morning and never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the scratching. The Old Farmhouse. Christmas in the countryside sounded like the perfect way to end the year. After the chaos of city life, my girlfriend Claire and I decided to rent a charming old farmhouse for the holidays. Nestled in the hills of Vermont, it promised peace, snowy landscapes, and the kind of isolation that made you feel like you were in a snow globe. The house was quaint, with a wraparound porch, a wood-burning fireplace, and a massive tree already decorated in the living room. It was like stepping into a Hallmark movie, except for one oddity. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a peculiar figurine. It was about a foot tall, carved from dark wood, depicting a hunched figure cloaked in a tattered robe. Its face was hollowed, with empty eyes and a mouth frozen in a twisted grin. I assumed it was some kind of antique decoration. "Charming," Claire said, though she didn't sound convinced. We spent the first night sipping hot cocoa by the fire and exchanging small gifts. The quiet was comforting at first, but as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of an old house settling. Around midnight, Claire decided to go to bed, but I stayed up, scrolling through my phone. The fire had died down to embers, and the only light came from the Christmas tree's soft glow. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the window behind me. My heart jumped as I spun around, but there was nothing outside except the darkness of the snow-covered yard. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I stood up, peering through the frosted glass. The yard was empty. I laughed nervously at my own paranoia and headed upstairs to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to faint noises, a creak on the stairs, a soft rustling outside the bedroom door. Claire stirred beside me, but didn't wake. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was coming from the window in our bedroom. I sat up, staring at the glass. Something was moving outside, barely visible against the snow. I nudged Claire awake. "What is it?" she mumbled. "Someone's outside," I whispered. Her eyes widened as she followed my gaze. The shape was gone. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, every shadow in the room feeling too large, too alive. The next morning, I went outside to investigate. The snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near the house. I tried to shake off the unease as we went about our day, but the farmhouse felt different now, colder somehow. That evening, as we were making dinner, Claire pointed out something chilling. "Wasn't that figurine on the mantel yesterday?" she asked, motioning to the little wooden figure. It was now on the dining table, facing us. I stared at it, my skin crawling. "Maybe we moved it without thinking," I said, though I didn't believe it. Neither of us touched it, but throughout the evening, it seemed to change positions. Once it was near the window, later it was on the kitchen counter. By nightfall, I was ready to leave. Claire, always the rational one, convinced me to stay, saying it was probably just nerves playing tricks on us. But that night, things escalated. We were in bed when the tapping started again, louder and more frantic than before. Claire grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. And then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, they echoed through the house, coming up the stairs. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The door creaked open, but no one was there. Claire clung to me, her breathing rapid. "We have to get out of here." I agreed, and we scrambled to gather our things. But as we descended the stairs, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In the living room, the figurine was back on the mantel, but it was different now. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its grin seemed wider, more sinister. Suddenly, the fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. One of the shadows moved independently, growing larger until it stretched across the room. From the shadow stepped a figure, tall, cloaked, and impossibly dark. Its face was featureless except for those glowing eyes and that twisted grin. "Leave," it rasped, the words scraping like nails on glass. We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing only our coats and keys, we bolted into the snowy night. The car started on the first try, and we tore down the icy road, not daring to look back. We spent the rest of Christmas at a cheap motel, too shaken to talk about what had happened. A week later, the rental company called, asking why we'd left in such a hurry. I told them about the noises, the shadow, the figurine. The man on the other end went silent. "You're not the first," he finally said. I hung up, vowing never to set foot in that farmhouse or any isolated house ever again. Some places, I've learned, are best left alone. The Pike Peak Lodge. It was supposed to be an escape from the chaos of the holidays, a quiet Christmas retreat in a remote mountain lodge. Just me, my girlfriend Jessica, and our golden retriever, Max. We rented the Pike Peak Lodge, nestled deep in the Rockies, with no neighbours for miles and nothing but snow-covered trees surrounding us. We arrived on Christmas Eve, the drive up the winding mountain roads taking longer than expected due to a storm rolling in. By the time we reached the lodge, the sun had already set, and the world was shrouded in darkness. The lodge was massive, far bigger than the cozy cabin we'd envisioned. It had an old weathered charm, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that filled the main room with a comforting glow. "This is amazing," Jessica said as she dropped her bags. Max trotted around, sniffing every corner, tail wagging. I agreed. Despite the storm outside, the lodge felt like a Christmas postcard come to life. We unpacked, made hot cocoa, and settled in by the fire. Jessica put on some soft Christmas music, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at ease. That peace didn't last. It started subtly, with little things I might have brushed off if I'd been alone. Max growled softly at the window, his ears pinned back, but when I looked out, all I saw was snow. Later, Jessica swore she heard faint knocking, but I chalked it up to the wind rattling the old shutters. By the time we went to bed, the storm was in full force, howling against the windows. I lay awake for a while, listening to the wind, when I heard something else. Something distinct. A low, melodic humming. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the storm. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere below us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Jessica. She stirred, groggy. "Hear what?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Never mind. Go back to sleep." I convinced myself it was just the storm, or maybe an old heater kicking on. But when I closed my eyes, the humming grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right outside the bedroom door. That's when Max started barking. Loud, frantic barks that made my heart leap. I grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway, Jessica following close behind. Max was at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness below. His fur bristled, and his growls were low and guttural. "What's wrong, buddy?" I said, my voice trembling. The flashlight beam swept over the stairs and landed on the front door. It was wide open, snow blowing in and forming drifts on the wooden floor. Jessica gasped. "Did you lock the door?" "Of course I did," I said, though now I wasn't so sure. I closed the door and secured the latch, but the unease lingered. We searched the lodge, room by room, but found nothing. Still, Max refused to settle down, pacing nervously and barking at the shadows. We tried to go back to bed, but sleep was impossible. The lodge seemed to groan and creak more than before, the storm outside raging like an angry beast. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the humming. This time it was accompanied by soft, deliberate footsteps on the floorboards. "Do you hear that?" Jessica whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the living room. We grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed down the stairs, Max leading the way with a low growl. The living room was eerily still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Then I saw it. A figure stood by the fireplace, its back to us. It was tall and unnaturally thin, draped in what looked like tattered robes. The humming came from it, a haunting, otherworldly tune that made my skin crawl. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure stopped humming and slowly turned its head. I wished it hadn't. Its face was a grotesque mask of shadow and bone, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Its mouth stretched into a chilling grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Leave!" it hissed, the word echoing unnaturally. Max lunged, barking furiously, but the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. Jessica screamed, and I pulled her toward the door. We didn't stop to grab our things. We just ran, the storm swallowing us as we fled into the night. We made it to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine finally roared to life, I floored it, the tires skidding on the icy road. As we drove down the mountain, Jessica looked back at the lodge. Her face went pale. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "There's someone on the porch," she whispered. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it. A dark figure standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes following us as we disappeared into the storm. We didn't stop driving until we reached a small town hours later. When we told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "You stayed at Pike Peak Lodge?" one of them asked, his voice hushed. We nodded. "That place has been abandoned for years," he said. "No one's been up there since the fire." "What fire?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "The family that lived there. They all died in a Christmas Eve fire. People say their spirits still haunt the place, especially on snowy nights like this." I didn't sleep for days after that. We never went back for our things, and I don't think I'll ever set foot in a remote cabin again. The Pike Peak Lodge still stands, buried deep in the woods, waiting for its next visitors. And every Christmas Eve, I can't help but wonder if someone else is hearing that haunting hum, echoing through the dark. The shadow of St. Nicholas. Christmas had always been my favourite time of year. The glowing lights, the laughter of family, the aroma of cinnamon and pine. Everything about it felt magical. This year, though, was different. My fiancée, Linda, and I decided to spend Christmas alone, just the two of us, in a small rented cottage deep in the New England woods. The place was picturesque, like something out of a winter romance novel. A cozy little home surrounded by towering evergreens, blanketed in fresh snow, with a frozen creek glinting nearby. It seemed perfect for a quiet holiday getaway. But from the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy. The cottage was charming, no doubt, but something about it felt off. The air inside was colder than it should have been, even with the heater on full blast. And there was a peculiar smell, faint but distinct, like burnt wood and wet earth. "Probably just the fireplace," Linda said, brushing it off. That first night, we sat by the fire exchanging small gifts and drinking mulled wine. We laughed, told stories, and marvelled at the quiet of the woods. No cars, no distant city hum, just the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then came the bells, faint at first, barely audible over the wind outside. A soft jingling, like sleigh bells, drifting through the trees. "You hear that?" Linda asked, setting down her mug. "Probably just an animal," I replied, though my gut told me otherwise. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the cottage. Linda stood, peering out the frosted window. "Do you think someone's out there?" "In this weather? No way," I said, joining her. But as I looked out into the dark woods, I saw movement, something large, just beyond the tree line. "It's probably a deer," I said, though my voice wavered. Linda didn't look convinced, but she let it go, and we returned to the fire. The bell stopped. That night, I woke to a strange noise. A heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the roof. "Do you hear that?" Linda whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, from one end of the house to the other. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Are you crazy? Don't go out there!" Linda hissed. But I had to know. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and shone the flashlight on the roof. Nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw them, footprints in the snow. They were massive, far larger than any humans, and they led from the woods to our door. I froze, my breath visible in the icy air. The prince didn't lead away. "Come back inside," Linda shouted from the doorway. I didn't need to be told twice. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. We stayed awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house, but nothing more happened. The next morning, we found claw marks on the front door. Deep, jagged gouges, as if something had tried to get in. Linda wanted to leave, but I convinced her to stay. "It's just animals," I said, though I didn't believe it. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, the bells returned, louder this time and accompanied by faint, guttural laughter. We barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them. But the laughter grew closer, deeper, until it felt like it was inside the house. And then the knocking began. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Linda clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't answer it," she whispered. I nodded, but the knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the fireplace poker and approached the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice rasped, "Let me in." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, gravelly and cold, like wind scraping across ice. "Go away!" I shouted. The laughter returned, echoing through the house. And then the door burst open, sending the furniture flying. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. Around its neck hung a chain of rusted bells, jingling with every movement. Linda screamed, and I swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as if it was smoke. The creature lunged at me, its claws slicing through the air, and I fell backward. Linda grabbed a candlestick and threw it, and for a brief moment, the creature recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. "Light!" I shouted. We scrambled to light every candle in the house, and as the room filled with their warm glow, the creature retreated, its form flickering like a dying flame. It let out a bone-chilling wail before vanishing into the night. We didn't sleep that night, and by morning, we were packed and ready to leave. As we drove away, I looked back at the cottage one last time. Standing in the doorway was the shadowy figure, its glowing eyes watching us go. We never returned to New England, and we never celebrated Christmas in the woods again. Some traditions, I've learned, are better left untouched. The Winter Visitor. Christmas has always been my favourite time of year, a season where even the darkest days feel illuminated by warmth and joy. Last year, however, turned that sentiment on its head. What was supposed to be a quiet holiday retreat became the most horrifying experience of my life. I'd rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota, far from the bustle of the city. I wanted to escape the stress of work, unwind, and spend the holidays reading by the fire. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by snow-laden trees and utter silence. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the remoteness felt both freeing and isolating. When I arrived, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the snow sparkled under the pale winter sun, and the cabin itself was cozy, with a stone fireplace and rustic charm. I spent the first day unpacking and exploring the surrounding area. There was a frozen lake nearby, and I made plans to take a hike to it the following morning. That night, as I settled in with a book, I heard a knock at the door. It was faint but deliberate. Startled, I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I got up, my heart thudding in my chest, and peeked through the window. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered steps, but there was no one there. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. No response. I unlocked the door, opened it a crack, and looked outside. The cold air bit at my face, and I could see my breath puffing in the light. Still, no one was there. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, with no footprints leading to or from the door. I quickly shut and locked the door, telling myself it was just the wind. The next day I tried to brush it off as a fluke. Maybe I'd imagined it. I spent the morning hiking to the lake, marveling at the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But the unease lingered, a nagging feeling I couldn't quite shake. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the knock came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My pulse raced as I approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Gripping a fire poker for protection, I yanked the door open. Again, there was no one there. Just the empty woods and the faint howl of the wind. Then I saw it. In the snow, just beyond the porch, were 2 sets of footprints. They were impossibly large, far too big to be human, and they led from the woods to the edge of the porch before disappearing entirely. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my mind racing. Whatever had left those prints wasn't human. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to move and shift in unnatural ways. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. It came from the living room. I grabbed the fire poker and crept down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The coffee table had been overturned, and the front door was wide open, swinging gently in the wind. I knew I had locked it. As I approached the door to shut it, I heard something outside. A low, guttural growl. It sent shivers down my spine. I peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. Still, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I locked the door again and barricaded it with furniture. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it getting in. The next few days were a blur of terror. The knocking grew more frequent, always at night, and the footprints appeared closer to the cabin each morning. I stopped venturing outside altogether, too afraid of what might be waiting for me. On Christmas Eve, the activity escalated. It started with the knocking, louder and more frantic than before. Then came the scratching, long, deep scrapes against the wooden walls of the cabin, as if something with claws was trying to get in. The air inside the cabin grew frigid, colder than the winter air outside. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could see ice forming on the inside of the windows. Then I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. "Jacob!" It was coming from the fireplace. I backed away, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. The voice called my name again, louder this time, echoing through the room. "Jacob!" Suddenly, the fire roared to life, the flames unnaturally high and blue. In the glow, I saw a figure standing just beyond the hearth. It was tall, its head brushing the ceiling, and its body was cloaked in shadows. Its eyes burned like coals, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have come here," it growled. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door, my hands shaking. The voice followed me, its words incomprehensible now, a mix of growls and hisses. Then the pounding started. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, everywhere at once. The cabin shook as if it were caught in an earthquake, and I could hear wood splintering and glass shattering. I thought I was going to die. In a desperate attempt to escape, I climbed out the bedroom window and into the freezing night. The snow was deep, and I stumbled as I ran toward my car. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I sped down the narrow, icy road, not daring to look back. When I reached the nearest town, I told the locals what had happened. They exchanged uneasy glances, and one elderly man shook his head. "You stayed in the Devil's Hollow," he said. "That land's cursed. Folks say it's a hunting ground for something not of this world." I didn't need any more convincing. I drove straight home and never looked back. But even now, months later, I still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the wind is howling, I can hear that voice whispering my name. And every time, I wonder if it's coming back for me. The Wreath. Christmas has always been my favorite holiday. The lights, the music, the crisp air filled with the scent of pine, it all felt magical. This year, my wife Tessa and I wanted to escape the chaos of city life and rented a charming century-old farmhouse deep in the woods. It was supposed to be our cozy holiday retreat. The farmhouse was perfect, right out of a Hallmark card. A red door, frost-covered windows, and a massive stone fireplace that promised warmth. There was only one thing about it that gave me pause: a wreath hanging on the door. It wasn't made of pine or holly, but of twisted black branches and wilted ivy, dotted with what looked like animal bones. "That's festive," I joked, trying to mask my unease. Tessa didn't seem to notice anything odd. "Maybe it's local tradition," she said. I didn't argue. After all, it was just a wreath. The first few days were idyllic. We baked cookies, exchanged early gifts, and explored the snowy woods around the farmhouse. The silence was a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But then, on the third night, things started to feel wrong. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a soft tapping at the window. I glanced outside, expecting to see branches swaying in the wind, but the night was still. Snow blanketed the ground, unbroken by any tracks. "Tessa, did you hear that?" I whispered. But she was already asleep. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to bed. The next morning I noticed something odd. The wreath on the door had changed. The bones that were once scattered within the branches were now clustered in the center, forming a crude, jagged circle. "Tessa, look at this," I said, pointing it out. She squinted at it. "Maybe the wind moved them?" The wind? It didn't make sense, but I didn't press the issue. That night, the tapping returned louder this time, and it wasn't just at the window. It came from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. "Tessa," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What's going on?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Listen." She sat up, her eyes widening as the tapping grew more frantic. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "Let's check outside," I said, grabbing a flashlight. She hesitated but followed me to the door. When I opened it, the wreath was gone. In its place was a smear of something dark, trailing down the door like fingers had been dragged through ash. "What the hell?" I muttered, shining the flashlight around the porch. That's when I saw them. In the snow just beyond the porch were footprints, bare, human footprints, leading into the woods. "We need to leave," Tessa said, her voice shaking. But the car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. We were stranded. That night, the tapping turned into pounding. It shook the walls and rattled the windows. Tessa and I huddled by the fireplace. clutching each other as the sound grew deafening. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We barely had time to catch our breath when we heard a low, guttural voice whisper, "Let me in." It came from the door. "No!" I shouted, standing up and grabbing the fireplace poker. The voice repeated, more insistent this time. "Let me in!" I moved toward the door, my hand trembling as I locked the deadbolt. The pounding resumed, harder and more violent than before. The doorframe groaned under the pressure, and I feared it would splinter. "Go away!" Tessa screamed, tears streaming down her face. The pounding stopped. For a moment, all we heard was the crackling of the fire and our own panicked breathing. Then, the whispers began again, coming from every direction. "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" The voice seemed to seep into the house, surrounding us. The temperature plummeted, and our breath came out in visible puffs. Then, the wreath was back. It hung above the fireplace, its twisted branches blacker than ever, the bones arranged in a perfect circle. As we watched in horror, the center of the wreath began to glow, faint at first, but growing brighter. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The whispers turned to screams, and the glow intensified, filling the room with a blinding light. "Get rid of it!" Tessa shouted. I grabbed the wreath, its branches burning my hands as I tore it from the wall. The light dimmed as I threw it into the fireplace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wreath exploded into a plume of black smoke, filling the room with the stench of rot. The screams faded, and the house fell silent. The next morning, we left as soon as the car started. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse looked normal, almost inviting, but I knew better. We never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I think I can hear it, soft and distant, the tapping at the window and the whispered plea, "Let me in." The shadow of Christmas Eve. I had always dreamed of spending Christmas in a quaint, snow-covered village, so when my partner, Anna, found a cabin rental in a small, picturesque town in Montana, it felt perfect. The village looked like it belonged in a snow globe, with its twinkling lights, pine trees heavy with snow, and an ancient church bell that rang every hour. We arrived a week before Christmas, eager to escape the chaos of the city. The cabin was cozy, but had a peculiar atmosphere, like it had been frozen in time. The furniture was old, the wallpaper faded, and the air carried a faint, musty smell. But it was charming in its own way, and we quickly settled in. On our second night, we decided to explore the village. The townspeople were friendly, though there was an underlying tension in their smiles. When we mentioned our cabin's location at the edge of the forest, a few exchanged uneasy glances. "Stay indoors after dark," one elderly man said, his voice low. Anna laughed nervously. "Why's that?" "It's just safer," he replied, avoiding eye contact. We brushed it off as small-town superstition, but as the days passed, strange things began to happen. On the fourth night, we sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa, when we heard a faint sound outside, a soft crunching in the snow. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but when I peeked out the window, there were footprints. They led from the forest edge to the cabin's front porch. "Someone's messing with us," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Anna grabbed my arm. "Don't go out there." I hesitated, but ultimately stayed inside. The footprints unnerved me, but they didn't appear again the next day. That evening, the unease grew. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted us awake. It came from the roof, "What was that?" Anna whispered, clutching the blanket. "Probably snow falling off," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Another thud followed, this one closer to the bedroom. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking on the roof. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, intending to investigate, but when I opened the door, a gust of icy wind nearly knocked me over. The footprints from before had returned, circling the cabin this time. I slammed the door shut and locked it. "We're staying inside," I said firmly. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The footprints didn't stop at the door. They seemed to disappear into thin air. Anna suggested we leave, but a heavy snowstorm had moved in, making the roads impassable. We decided to wait it out, though every hour in the cabin felt heavier than the last. That night, the bells from the village church sounded different. Instead of their usual clear melodic tone, they were distorted, as if coming from underwater. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the fire in the hearth flickered unnaturally. Then we heard it. A low, guttural voice, whispering our names. "Did you hear that?" Anna asked, her face pale. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers came from all around us, as if the cabin itself were alive. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, elongating and writhing like living creatures. One shadow, larger than the rest, loomed near the ceiling. Its form vaguely human, but twisted and wrong. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand, but their tone was menacing, filled with malice. "Get the car ready," Anna said, her voice shaking. I grabbed the keys and stepped outside into the freezing night. The snow was falling thick and fast, but something else caught my attention. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. But I could feel its gaze heavy and cold, as if it were peeling away my soul. I stumbled back into the cabin. "We're not going anywhere," I said. The figure began to move, gliding through the snow without leaving footprints. It stopped a few feet from the porch, its head tilting unnaturally. The whispers inside the cabin became screams. Anna grabbed my arm. "We have to do something!" Desperate, I grabbed the Bible from the nightstand, a leftover from the previous tenants, and began reading aloud. The shadow on the wall recoiled, its movements frantic. The screams intensified, then abruptly stopped. When I looked out the window, the figure was gone. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the roads were clear. We packed our things and left without looking back. I don't know what we encountered in that cabin, but every Christmas since, I've avoided small towns and cabins in the woods. Some things are better left unexplored. A silent night to remember. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. No malls, no crowds, no pressure. Just me and my husband Johan, spending Christmas in a secluded cabin in northern Maine. The property was nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was miles away. It sounded idyllic when we booked it, but now, thinking back, I wish we'd chosen something closer to civilization. The drive to the cabin was treacherous, with snow piling up and the GPS barely holding a signal. When we finally arrived, it was already dark. The cabin was charming in a rustic way. A stone chimney, wide wooden beams, and a single string of Christmas lights hanging haphazardly across the porch. We unloaded the car quickly, eager to get inside where it was warm. The interior was just as cozy as the pictures had promised, with a roaring fireplace, a small but decorated tree, and a handwritten welcome note from the owner. "This is perfect," I said, and for a while it was. We cooked dinner together, sipped wine by the fire, and exchanged early gifts. The snowstorm outside only added to the atmosphere, wrapping the cabin in a thick, quiet blanket. But then the quiet became unsettling. Around midnight, we were sitting on the couch, watching an old Christmas movie, when I heard it. A faint knock. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Johan paused the movie and listened. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the door. "It's probably just the wind," Johan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the knocking continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It wasn't random either. It was deliberate, as if someone or something was testing each wall. Johan grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate, while I stayed by the fire, clutching my phone. He returned a few minutes later, his face pale. "There's nothing out there," he said. "No tracks in the snow, nothing. It's just the wind." But we both knew it wasn't the wind. We went to bed soon after, hoping that ignoring it would make it stop. For a while, it seemed to work. The knocking ceased, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the wind outside. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. Soft at first, then growing louder. This time it was coming from the roof. "Johan," I whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned and sat up, listening. The knocking had turned into heavy footsteps, like boots crunching on snow, but they were above us. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the flashlight again. "No way," I said, pulling on my coat. "I'm not staying here alone." We crept through the cabin, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The footsteps followed us, moving from the roof to the porch. When we reached the living room, we saw the front door slowly creak open. The porch light flickered, casting long, uneven shadows. Johan shone the flashlight outside, revealing nothing. "Hello?" he called into the night. There was no response. Johan shut the door and locked it, but the moment he did, a loud crash came from the kitchen. We ran in to find one of the cabinets wide open, dishes shattered on the floor. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" Johan said, his voice rising in panic. Before I could answer, the Christmas lights on the tree flickered and went out. The fire sputtered, plunging us into near darkness. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. Johan aimed the flashlight, and we both froze. At the end of the hall stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with skin so pale it almost glowed. Its eyes were sunken, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "Get out," it whispered, the words rasping like dry leaves. We bolted for the front door, but when we opened it, the snowstorm had transformed into something unnatural. The wind howled, swirling in impossible patterns, and the snow seemed to rise up, forming shapes, twisting, writhing figures that reached for us with icy hands. We slammed the door and backed away, the growl growing louder behind us. "Upstairs," Johan said, pulling me toward the staircase. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, piling furniture against the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The growling stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound. It came from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath our feet. "We're not staying here," Johan said, grabbing my hand. "We're running for the car." I nodded, too terrified to argue. We made our way downstairs, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The scratching followed us, growing louder with each step. When we reached the living room, we saw the figure again, standing by the fireplace. Its grin widened as we approached, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "You should have left," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Johann grabbed the fire poker and swung it, but the figure vanished, dissolving into a swirl of ash. We didn't wait to see if it would return. The storm outside was blinding, the wind cutting like knives, but we managed to reach the car. Johann fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, while I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure emerging from the snow. When the car finally started, we tore down the driveway, the tires skidding on the icy road. The cabin disappeared behind us, swallowed by the storm. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, hours later. We tried to explain what happened to the local police, but they just looked at us like we were crazy. When we tried to contact the cabin owner, the phone number was disconnected. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that cabin. Johann refuses to talk about it, and I haven't been able to sleep through the night since. All I know is this: there are places in this world that are better left undisturbed. Places where something ancient and malevolent still lingers, waiting for the next unwitting visitors. The Whispering Tree. When I was growing up, Christmas was always my favourite time of year. The lights, the laughter, the warmth of family, it all felt magical. But after my parents passed away, the holidays became hollow. Last year, I decided to spend Christmas somewhere remote, away from memories that felt more painful than joyful. I rented a small cabin deep in the Appalachian woods, far from any neighbours or towns. It was an old place, the kind that looked like it belonged in a postcard, with a snow-covered roof and a chimney puffing lazy wisps of smoke. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I arrived a few days before Christmas and spent my first day unpacking and exploring the surrounding forest. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches weaving together overhead like a canopy. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. That evening, as I settled in by the fire with a mug of hot cocoa, I felt a strange sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just an odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if I were being watched. I shrugged it off as nerves and went to bed. The first night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was a low, murmuring voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. It seemed to come from outside, near the edge of the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I didn't see anyone. Just the snow, untouched except for my tracks from earlier. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I found footprints outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The prints were small, almost childlike, and they led from the forest to the cabin and back again. My stomach knotted as I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere, inside the cabin, outside, even from the walls. I lit the fireplace and every candle I could find, trying to push back the darkness. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap on the window. But when I looked, no one was there. A few minutes later, it came again, this time at the front door. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I opened the door a crack, bracing myself for... I didn't know what. But there was nothing. Just the cold wind and the dark forest. As I shut the door, I noticed something on the porch. A single withered wreath made of twigs and berries. It hadn't been there before. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. The nearest town was miles away, and with the snowstorm that had rolled in overnight, walking wasn't an option. I was trapped. That night, the whispering turned into voices, many voices, overlapping and urgent. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but their tone was clear. They were angry. The knocking returned, louder and more insistent, now coming from every door and window. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, shoving the dresser and bed against the door. And then I heard it. Laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the cabin. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine and decay. The fire in the hearth went out, plunging the room into darkness. I sat in the corner, clutching a flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. That's when I saw them. Figures, small, shadowy shapes, peering in through the windows. Their faces were pale, their eyes black pits that seemed to drink in the light. They pressed their hands against the glass, leaving smears of frost as they stared at me. And then they smiled. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as the cabin shook. The dresser slid across the floor and the door flew open. A gust of icy wind filled the room, and I could feel them, those shadowy figures, rushing toward me. I don't remember much after that. I woke up outside, lying in the snow. The cabin was gone, nothing but an empty clearing where it had stood. My car was still there, the engine running as if nothing had been wrong. I drove straight to the nearest town, not stopping until I reached a motel. When I told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "That's the whispering tree," one of them said. "People say it's cursed. Folks who stay near it, well, they don't always come back." I didn't ask any more questions. I just got in my car and kept driving, vowing never to spend Christmas alone in the woods again. But sometimes late at night I still hear them, the whispers, faint and far away, but unmistakable. And every time I wonder if they'll find me again. Thank you for listening. Bloody subscribe. And I wish you a scary Christmas. Good night.